A Dutch cloth merchant squints through a tiny curved piece of glass at a thread, and 250 years later, 6 million people are dead. That is not a metaphor. That is the argument we are making today. Today, we are tracing the academic arc from Ibn Sahl's lens to van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, in the case that the Holocaust was not a historical accident, but an inevitability, built brick by brick inside the halls of accredited academia. By the end of this episode, you will understand how a single invention triggered a chain of epiphanies, why the failure of peer review is more dangerous than any ideology, and what the concept of idolatry, scientific and religious, has to do with genocide. I've got someone here who has been deep in this argument, and I want to start with the most provocative version of the thesis. Lay it on us.
So the core argument is this: the Holocaust should not be attributed primarily to a furious, goose-stepping Nazi. It should be attributed to a fatal flaw within accredited academia. And that flaw has a pattern. Every single time humanity crosses what the source material calls an epiphanic threshold, a moment of paradigm-shifting knowledge, the dissonance it creates among the intelligentsia results in social upheaval and attending human rights violations. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. With each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval gets worse.
So it's like a ratchet. Each click makes the next one more dangerous.
Exactly. A ratcheting mechanism is precisely the language used to describe it. And to demonstrate this, the argument doesn't try to cover all of human history. It tracks a single invention, the optical lens, and follows the consequences of that one invention across 13 epiphanic thresholds, each one prefacing the next.
13 thresholds. And it all starts with a lens.
It starts with Ibn Sahl's lens, and from there you get Galileo's telescope, and then almost immediately van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and then Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, Jefferson Davis, the American Civil War, Mary Baker Eddy, and finally a coffee shop in Vienna in 1910, where the architects of the 20th century's worst atrocities are sitting in a cloud of opium smoke, planning a global war of extinction. All of it traceable back to one curved piece of glass.
Okay, I need to slow down on van Leeuwenhoek because I think a lot of people know the name vaguely but don't actually know the story. Who was this guy and what did he actually do?
So van Leeuwenhoek, and nobody remembers him partly because nobody can pronounce Leeuwenhoek, was not a trained scientist. He was a draper. He was in the fabric business. He originally wanted to inspect the fibers he was using in his drapery work, and he started modifying lenses to do that. And then in 1676, he looked at something under his modified lens and realized he was seeing an entire dimension of life that no human being had ever witnessed before.
He was just trying to check his cloth quality.
He was just trying to check his cloth. And instead he discovered bacteria, red blood cells, spermatozoa, the cellular structure of muscle fibers. He identified the cellular composition of life itself. And then he did something remarkable. He started writing letters. He began a correspondence with the Royal Society in London in 1676, and that series ran to more than 190 reports of discovery.
190 letters. That's not a correspondence, that's a career.
It is a career, and the Royal Society, to their credit, received him with patience, even though he was initially met with incredulity. The man was, in the words of the source material, clearly barking mad. But they entertained all reports, and that openness is actually a crucial part of this story.
Why is the Royal Society's openness so important here? Because I'd assume most institutions would just dismiss a draper writing letters about tiny invisible creatures.
Right, and that's the thing. The Royal Society was founded by King Charles II immediately after the Cromwell period, and the founding purpose was specifically to safeguard academia from populism. Charles II was an extraordinary student of history, and he understood that progress needed a moderating institution. The Royal Society accepted all comers, regardless of their origins or standing in society. Van Leeuwenhoek only wrote to them because they had that open-door policy.
So the Crown was actually protecting scientific inquiry, not fighting it.
Exactly, and the source material is very pointed about this. The Crown has been accused of resisting the Enlightenment, but that is described as a patented lie. The Royal Society bridged the divide between classical scholars, who couldn't tolerate scientific inquiry that might erode long-held doctrines, and agnostic scholars, who couldn't entertain a creator in any starting assumption. The Royal Society held that balance, and it persisted until 1905.
Okay, so let's talk about what Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope actually did to people's minds. Because discovering bacteria is one thing, but the source material suggests this created an existential crisis.
It created a profound one. And here's the question that nobody could answer. If human beings are just a collection of millions, maybe billions of little life forms that arrange themselves like a mosaic tile floor, what are human beings? What is a cat or a dog? If you start taking apart a building brick by brick, what remains should be the unique individual. But nowhere in any dissected human tissue could anyone find the seat of the soul.
That's a genuinely terrifying question to be sitting with in the 1600s.
It is. And it split academia into two camps. You had the classical scholars, who were grounded in moral doctrines and philosophies that had withstood the test of time. And you had the empiricists, who abandoned all doctrines in the name of eliminating bias and went where no one had gone before. And the empiricists, the agnostics, were making the scientific advances. But they were shackled by their own starting assumptions.
What do you mean, shackled by their own starting assumptions?
So the agnostic method required that you exclude a creator from all underpinning assumptions. That was the null set, the control group. And in terms of producing results, it worked. But it left them with no way to explain the ultimate paradox. If we are all just an aggregation of cells, each of them distinct life forms, what exactly is a person? The classical scholars found this hilarious, by the way. They just pointed to scripture. The body is a temple. Of course it's made of bricks. Round one to the classicists.
And the agnostics just kept going anyway.
They didn't even hear the bell. And here's what's important. The source material notes that science has still failed to identify the origins and locus of consciousness in a human being. The closest we've come is identifying the brainstem as the neurological neighborhood. But that's like saying there's a star somewhere inside our own galaxy, given how many neurons are in the human brainstem. The classical scholars are still laughing, and the laughter is still deserved.
Wait, so the fundamental question Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope raised, what is a person, is still unanswered?
Still unanswered. And that matters enormously for what comes next. Because the one thing scientific method did confirm was that at the microscopic level of existence, there was nothing distinguishing human tissues from any other mammalian tissue. Reptiles had distinct differences, fish more so. But mammals, structurally identical, only different in size.
And I can already see where this is going. If science can't find what makes humans categorically different from other animals, then the moral framework that protects human life starts to wobble.
You've just described the slippery slope, and the source material is explicit. Neither classical scholars nor their agnostic colleagues could have predicted just how slippery it was. A few more dots had to be connected, and half of the people who would connect them weren't even born yet. Two agnostics named Thomas Malthus and Charles Darwin were waiting just beyond Van Leeuwenhoek's intersection.
Before we get to Malthus and Darwin, I want to stay on the microscope for a second, because there's something you said about the leap from Galileo's telescope to Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope that I think deserves more attention. Because on the surface, those seem like very different inventions.
They seem different, but they're technically doing the same thing. Telescopes and microscopes both magnify images that appear very small. The only true difference is in the physical constraints and focal depths. Van Leeuwenhoek's modifications to lenses and eyepieces made the telescope useful in magnifying very small objects that were close, rather than very large objects that were far away. It's the same optical principle, just pointed in the opposite direction.
So Galileo looked out and Van Leeuwenhoek looked in.
Exactly. And the consequences of looking in were, if anything, more destabilizing.
Galileo challenged the church's cosmology. Van Leeuwenhoek challenged the church's anthropology. The source material puts it this way: if you thought Galileo was rubbing the orthodoxy the wrong way, multiply Galileo's challenges 100-fold and you reach a fair assessment of what Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope did to the Enlightenment. 100-fold. That's a staggering claim. What saved the church from complete collapse in that moment?
Ironically, their own doctrine. The church had been teaching all along that the body was merely a temple. So when cells were discovered, church fathers could nod knowingly and feign prescience. Of course the body is built of little bricks, we've been saying that for centuries. That rhetorical move bought them time. But it was borrowed time. Borrowed until when?
Until 1905. That is the year the source material identifies as the point of no return. In 1905, it was finally proven that bacteria and viruses cause disease, not God, not sin, not divine punishment. And that proof was catastrophic for the church's authority, because between 1676 and 1905, the church had retained authority on the question of disease. Diseases were punishments for sin. That was the official position. And in 1905, science proved it was simply wrong.
So, for 230 years, the church's answer to why people got sick was that they had sinned. And then, in 1905, that entire framework collapsed completely. And the source material describes the result as the hubris of science running rampant across Europe. The divorce between religion and science, which had been a long separation, became final in 1905. And from that point forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. But here is the critical problem. The few who were following genuine empirical method were outpaced by those who were publishing pseudoscience in what is described as an orgy of intellectual ambition.
An orgy of intellectual ambition. That's a vivid phrase. What does that actually look like in practice?
It looks like hypothesis being presented to the general public as established science instead of as mere hypothesis. And that is the central failure the source material identifies, a consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. When peer review breaks down, when the gatekeeping mechanism fails, bad ideas get the same credibility as good ones. And in the early 20th century, some of the bad ideas were catastrophically bad.
This is where I want to push back a little, because you could argue that peer review has always had failures. Why does the failure in this particular period lead to something as extreme as the Holocaust?
That's the right question. And the answer is the ratchet. By 1905, you've had 250 years of accumulated epiphanies, each one building on the last, each one widening the schism between religious and scientific authority. The social infrastructure that would have absorbed the shock of bad ideas, the moral framework, the institutional checks, the shared cosmology, had been progressively eroded at each threshold. By 1905, there was very little left to absorb the shock.
So the system was already fragile before the worst ideas arrived.
Extremely fragile.
And then in 1910, 5 years after the final divorce between religion and science, we get the scene that the source material describes as the culmination of this entire arc. The Café Central in Vienna. In a thick cloud of opium smoke, Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Dmitry Mitrinovich, and Vladimir Lenin in absentia are sitting together and planning what they describe as a global war of extinction.
Wait, all of those people were in the same coffee shop? According to the source material, yes. And what they agreed on was that the revolution to come had to be sudden, violent, and catalytic. The world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie would be eliminated in one fell swoop. And their plan was described as extremely scientific. It was grounded in what was then accepted as science, which is precisely the problem. It wasn't science, it was insanity dressed in scientific language.
And on the periphery of that coffee clutch was someone else.
A loner named Adolf, soaking it all in from a table across the room, and he began making plans of his own. The source material describes this as the near completion of the march toward the Holocaust. All that was needed at that point was a spark.
That image is genuinely chilling. A young Hitler sitting in a Viennese cafe, listening to the architects of communist revolution plan a war of extinction and taking notes.
And the source material frames this as the direct consequence of Ibn Sal's lens. That is the argument. Not that the lens caused the Holocaust in any simple causal sense, but that the chain of epiphanies it initiated, and the repeated failure of academia to handle those epiphanies responsibly, created the conditions in which something like the Holocaust became not just possible, but, in the argument's framing, inevitable.
I want to dig into the diagnosis the source material offers, because I think it's the most counterintuitive part of this whole argument. It's not just peer review failure. There's another word used.
Idolatry. And this is where the argument gets genuinely original. Failures in peer review cannot fully explain the dissonance that happens at epiphanic moments. The source material argues that idolatry is the only diagnosis that explains intellectual dissonance at efficacious thresholds in scientific history.
Idolatry is a religious word. How does it apply to scientists? The argument redefines it. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than they are to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. And since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to it. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. And when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's actually a really uncomfortable observation, because it means the problem isn't bad people. It's a structural feature of how human beings relate to their own beliefs. Exactly. And the source material makes the point that what every major religion instructs and what peer review in science enforces is the same thing. We are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is described as the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome, but it must be done.
So the solution isn't to choose between religion and science. It's to hold both with enough humility that neither becomes an idol. That's the argument. And the source material has a specific preference here: agnostic science. Not atheist science, which excludes a creator as a matter of conviction, and not ecclesiastical science, which includes a creator as a matter of conviction. Agnostic science, which treats the question of a creator as genuinely open and applies reason without prejudging the answer. The argument is that both atheist science and ecclesiastical science impart bias in the genesis of every phenomenon they examine.
That's a position that would make both committed atheists and committed believers uncomfortable, which probably means it's worth taking seriously. That's usually a good sign. And it connects back to the Van Leeuwenhoek moment specifically. The source material notes that you don't want to read a scientific text from the early days of microscopy unless you want a good laugh. Everyone was onto something, but in the rush to be first to publish, some very comical hypotheses were offered on life at the microscopic level. The race to publish, the intellectual ambition, the idolatry of being first, those are the same forces that, scaled up and stripped of moral constraint, produced the catastrophes of the 20th century.
The rush to publish in the 1600s and the rush to publish pseudoscience in the early 1900s are the same impulse, just with higher stakes.
The same impulse, amplified by the ratchet. And here's what makes Van Leeuwenhoek's contribution so singular. The source material makes the point that neither the electron microscope, nor the X-ray machine, nor the MRI machine have revealed an entire sphere of life hitherto unknown to mankind. Microscopes did. That was a one-time event in human history, an entire dimension of existence, invisible to every human being who had ever lived, suddenly visible. Nothing before or since has done that.
And the world was not ready for it.
Not remotely. The source material says, trust me, until Van Leeuwenhoek, there was nothing whatsoever which could have predicted the existence of life forms at such small scales of biology. Everyone jumped on board Van Leeuwenhoek's bandwagon, and in short order it was confirmed that every tissue of every living creature was composed exclusively of cellular forms of life. No church anywhere was prepared to cope with that. Not the Roman Catholic Church, not the Lutheran Church, not the Presbyterian Church.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the question of what a person is if we're just a mosaic of cells. Because that question didn't get answered in Van Leeuwenhoek's time. It fed directly into Malthus and Darwin. Can you trace that connection?
So the connection is this. Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope established that at the microscopic level, there is nothing structurally distinguishing human tissue from other mammalian tissue. Only size. That observation, combined with the agnostic method's exclusion of a creator from starting assumptions, left the question of human uniqueness entirely open. And into that open question stepped Malthus with his theories about population and resources, and then Darwin with natural selection. Both of them are described as falling into the rabbit hole opened by Ibn Sal's lens.
And once you have Darwin's framework applied to human beings without a moral counterweight, you get social Darwinism. And from there, it's a short road to eugenics and the Holocaust. That's the trajectory. And the source material notes that righteous people were fighting back almost from the beginning. James Oglethorpe's plan for the American colonies is cited as an early example of resistance. The American Civil War is described as the world's first war against pseudoscience, specifically against the pseudoscientific justifications for slavery that Jefferson Davis and others were advancing. And Ulysses S. Grant created the public education system specifically to stop this march in its tracks.
Wait, the Civil War as a war against pseudoscience? That's a framing I've never heard before. It's a striking reframe. The argument is that the scientific justifications for racial hierarchy, which were being published and treated as legitimate science in the 19th century, were pseudoscience, and the people who fought against slavery were, in a meaningful sense, fighting against the consequences of failed peer review. The righteous, as the source material puts it, gratefully slowed humanity's descent into madness on those battlefields, but to no avail. The march toward the Holocaust continued.
And then Mary Baker Eddy tried something different.
By the end of the 19th century, sensing academia's encroachment on religious paradigms of investigation, Mary Baker Eddy attempted to reframe religion, and specifically prayer, as a scientific process. It was an attempt to meet science on its own terms, to argue that faith itself could be empirically validated. But in 1905, when the proof came that diseases were not punishments from God but the biological consequences of pathogens, that attempt was overtaken by events. The divorce between religion and science became final. So every attempt to slow the march failed. Oglethorpe, Grant, Eddy, all of them bought time but couldn't stop it.
That is the argument. And the source material is clear. At the juncture of 1905, there was no way to stop the Holocaust. From that point forward, the conditions were set. The only thing missing was the spark.
I want to sit with that claim for a moment because it's a heavy one. Saying the Holocaust was inevitable is not the same as saying it was justified or that no one was responsible. How does the source material handle that distinction?
The argument is about structural inevitability, not moral absolution. The point is that by the time you reach 1905, the institutional failures have accumulated to the point where a catastrophe of that magnitude becomes structurally predictable. That doesn't remove individual moral responsibility, it adds institutional moral responsibility. The argument is actually more damning than simply blaming Hitler, because it implicates the entire apparatus of accredited academia across centuries.
That's a harder argument to sit with, honestly, because it means the problem isn't solved by removing one bad actor. Precisely. And the source material is explicit that this pattern has not ended. The Enlightenment is described not as a point in time, but as an ongoing historical process. Every generation is born into ignorance, and every generation has contributed toward the enlightenment of mankind. The implication is that we are still in it, and the failures of peer review and the idolatry of belief are still operating. Which means the question isn't just what happened in the past, it's what epiphanic threshold are we approaching now, and are we any better equipped to handle it?
That is exactly the question the source material leaves open, and it's addressed specifically to Gen Z. The argument is being made to a generation that has inherited a world that appears irrational and dangerous, and the response is, it appears that way because it is that way. But it is that way for traceable, understandable reasons, and understanding those reasons is the beginning of doing something about them.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the lens, the microscope, the cells, the coffee shop in Vienna, what's the through line that actually matters for someone listening right now?
The through line is this: knowledge is not neutral. Every time humanity gains a genuinely new way of seeing the world, it creates dissonance. And dissonance, if it's not managed with intellectual humility and institutional integrity, produces violence. The microscope didn't cause the Holocaust, but the failure to handle what the microscope revealed, with honesty, with peer review, with the willingness to say, this is a hypothesis, not a fact, that failure, repeated across 13 epiphanic thresholds, did.
And the idolatry diagnosis is what makes this argument different from a standard history of science. Because it's not just about institutions, it's about a human tendency that exists in all of us.
In all of us. The source material is unsparing on this point. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. When those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. That is the mechanism, and it operates in theologians and scientists and politicians, and honestly, in all of us listening to this right now.
So the actionable insight isn't fix academia, it's something more personal than that.
It's both. Fix academia, yes, maintain the integrity of peer review, distinguish hypothesis from established fact, hold the gatekeeping function seriously. But also, personally, be willing to be wrong. Be willing to have your justifications exposed as fallacies and not collapse your identity around them. What every major religion instructs and what peer review enforces is the same thing. We are our own worst counsel. That's the hardest thing to accept, and it's the most important.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We started with a draper in Delft squinting at a thread, and what that moment set in motion was not just a scientific revolution, but a 250-year stress test of humanity's ability to handle truth. And we failed it, repeatedly. Not because we were evil, but because we were human, attached to our beliefs, resistant to dissonance, willing to dress hypothesis in the language of certainty.
And the cost of that failure was measured in millions of lives. The source material's argument is that the Holocaust was the amplified consequence of a pattern that began the moment Ibn Sahl curved a piece of glass. Not because knowledge is dangerous, but because the institutions and individuals entrusted with handling knowledge failed, repeatedly, to maintain the humility that genuine inquiry requires.
And the Enlightenment, as the source material frames it, is still ongoing, which means we are still in the middle of this story.
Still in the middle. And the source material ends with a phrase that I think is worth sitting with: God forbid the Enlightenment ever end, because the alternative to an ongoing process of discovery and correction is a fixed belief system that cannot update. And fixed belief systems, whether religious or scientific, are precisely what the idolatry diagnosis describes. The moment you stop being willing to be wrong is the moment you become dangerous.
The moment you stop being willing to be wrong is the moment you become dangerous. That's going to stay with me.
It should stay with all of us, because the next epiphanic threshold is coming. It always does. The question is whether we will handle it better than the generations before us handled Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope.
And we now have something those generations didn't have: the ability to look back and see the pattern, to see how the ratchet works, to understand that dissonance at an epiphanic threshold is not a sign that the discovery is wrong, it's a sign that the work of integration has just begun.
That's the gift of this kind of historical analysis. Not to make us feel guilty about the past, but to make us more clear-eyed about the present. The march toward the Holocaust was built from accumulated failures of intellectual humility. The march away from the next catastrophe has to be built from the opposite.
A draper wanted to check his cloth. He ended up asking what a human being is. We still haven't fully answered that question, but maybe the asking of it, done honestly and with humility, is the point.